Professor Zhang Xuan doesn't carry a gun, but he holds the future. In 2024, in Beijing, he issued three shocking predictions about the United States. Trump wins the election? That happened. Operation Epic Fury launches in February 2026? That happened. But his third prediction will truly haunt you. A superpower can win every battle, yet still lose the entire war. Why is America mysteriously absent from 2,600-year-old prophecies regarding the Persian alliance? Join me as we decode the systemic collapse of a global operating system right now. Operation Epic Fury. It began not with a roar, but with a silent shadow crossing the Iranian border. Imagine the scene, February 28, 2026. In the darkness over Tehran, the B-2 Spirit, a billion-dollar ghost, disappears from radar, dropping precision-guided munitions on command centers buried deep beneath the mountains. On the surface, it looks like a masterpiece of modern engineering. F-35 Lightning IIs and F-22 Raptors fill the skies, carving through air defenses as if they weren't even there. From the Persian Gulf, carrier strike groups launch a relentless rain of Tomahawk cruise missiles, neutralizing hundreds of targets in the first 48 hours alone. It wasn't just a war, it was a technology show, a demonstration of absolute, unchallengeable dominance. By all traditional metrics, the United States was winning. Communication lines? Severed. The Iranian Navy? Effectively erased from the map. The Supreme Leader? Gone in a surgical strike that left the world breathless. Pentagon officials spoke with a quiet, lethal confidence. They projected a conflict lasting 4 to 6 weeks. A clean war. A decisive victory. And why wouldn't they? The world was watching a superpower flex its muscles with a level of precision history has never seen. But here is the insight most military analysts missed. The strongest weapon is often the one that doesn't need to be fired. Because once you pull the trigger, the illusion of invincibility is replaced by the reality of the grind. When the missiles stop flying and the smoke begins to settle, you are no longer fighting a machine. You are fighting a system. And systems, unlike machines, don't break when you hit them. They adapt. While the American public was mesmerized by the high-definition footage of exploding bunkers, Professor Zhang was looking at something else. He wasn't watching the F-35s. He was watching the clock. He knew that the opening phase, the phase of fire and steel, was just the prologue. Because wars are not won by who hits the hardest in the first hour. They are won by who is still standing in the 1,000th hour. How does a giant fall? It's rarely from a single, heavy blow. Most of the time, a giant falls because it has simply grown too heavy to stand. To understand why Professor Zhang predicts an American defeat in 2026, we have to look at a rule of history that most politicians choose to ignore. It's called the complexity paradox. Anthropologist Joseph Tainter studied the collapse of great civilizations, from the Maya to the Roman Empire. His findings were startlingly consistent. As societies grow, they solve their problems by becoming more complex. They build more infrastructure. They create more bureaucracy. They expand their military reach. For a while this works, but eventually you hit a wall known as diminishing marginal returns. This is the point where the cost of maintaining the system starts to outweigh the benefits the system provides. Now, look at the United States today. It is the most sophisticated operating system in human history. A global web of military bases, a massive petrodollar financial architecture, overlapping security commitments on every single continent. It is brilliant, it is powerful, and it is incredibly expensive to keep alive. In the 2026 conflict, this complexity becomes a lethal trap. Think about the math of the battlefield. Iran, or its proxies, can launch a swarm of suicide drones. Cost to produce? Perhaps $2,000 each. To stop them, the United States must fire an advanced interceptor missile. Cost? $2 million per shot. That is a 1,000 to 1 ratio. Iran isn't trying to outgun the American military in a fair fight. They are trying to overload the system. They are forcing a high-tech empire to spend its wealth at an unsustainable rate just to maintain the status quo. Every time Washington solves a tactical problem with more technology, it adds more weight to the machine, more logistics, more debt, more complexity. This is what Professor Zhang calls a thermodynamic collapse. It's like a massive star that grows so large it can no longer support its own gravity. History shows us that empires don't usually collapse when they are at their weakest. They collapse when they are at their most complex. When the system is so overloaded that one small disruption can trigger a total shutdown. But if the known weapons are failing the economic test, what about the weapons we don't see? But let's stop for a moment. If you believe that everything the United States has is limited to what you see on the evening news, the F-35s or the Tomahawk missiles, then you are vastly underestimating a force with a nearly $1 trillion annual budget. In the world of military intelligence, there is a term for what lies beneath the surface: black programs. These are unacknowledged projects, weapons that don't exist on any public ledger, developed in the shadows of places like Area 51 or Dugway Proving Ground. Think back to 1991 during Operation Desert Storm. The world was stunned when stealth technology, the F-117 Nighthawk, suddenly appeared over Baghdad, rendering an entire Soviet-made air defense system invisible and obsolete. That technology had been operational for over a decade before the public ever knew it existed. Military analysts suggest that what we are seeing in the opening phase of the 2026 conflict is only the outer shell. Underneath, the U.S. likely possesses directed energy weapons, lasers and high-powered microwaves capable of frying drone swarms in a heartbeat. There are whispers of kinetic bombardment satellites, rods from God, capable of striking any target on Earth with the force of a nuclear weapon, but without the radioactive fallout. So we have to ask the uncomfortable question: is Washington losing because they are powerless? Or is this a calculated, strategic retreat? Game theory suggests a darker possibility. By refusing to use their ultimate cards, the U.S. might be prolonging the conflict on purpose. Why? To draw out the larger rivals, to force China or Russia to reveal their own hidden capabilities and commit their resources to a war of attrition they weren't prepared for. In this light, the American struggle isn't a sign of weakness, but a sophisticated bait. A trap designed to expose the true intentions of the global players waiting in the wings. The silence of the most advanced weapons in the world is often the loudest message of all. But as the military machines play their high-stakes game, the real damage is being done where no missile can reach. It's happening in the global markets. Because while the U.S. might be holding back its best weapons, the system that funds those weapons is beginning to bleed. While the generals are looking at satellite imagery of missile silos, the world's most powerful economists are looking at something much more fragile. They are looking at a strip of water only 21 miles wide, the Strait of Hormuz. To the average observer, Hormuz is just a shipping lane for oil. But to the architects of global power, it is the jugular vein of the American empire. Why? Because of the petrodollar. Since the 1970s, the global financial system has rested on a single, unspoken rule. The world buys oil in US dollars, and that money flows back into American banks. It is the operating system of US dominance. Now, look at the numbers. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through that narrow corridor every single day. That is 20% of the world's daily consumption. Professor Zhang argues that Iran doesn't need to sink an aircraft carrier to win. They don't even need to physically block the strait. All they need to do is make the strait uninsurable. This is where the analysis changes from military strategy to financial reality. Think about Lloyd's of London, the heart of the global maritime insurance market. The moment a single Iranian drone hits a commercial tanker or a single sea mine is detected, the risk profile shifts. If insurance companies refuse to cover the vessels, the tankers stop moving. It doesn't matter how many F-35s are in the air. No shipping company will risk a billion-dollar vessel and its crew in contested waters without insurance. It is a paper blockade, and it is more effective than any naval wall. When the oil stops flowing, the dollars stop recycling. Global energy prices spike. Inflation explodes. Stock markets react with a level of panic selling that makes 2008 look like a minor correction. And here is the insight you won't hear in the news. The United States isn't losing this war on the deck of a ship. It is losing on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. It is a war of systemic exhaustion. How long can a debt-heavy superpower maintain its global commitments when its currency is shaking and its energy costs are quadrupling? The answer is, not long. This is the death point Zhang describes. A scenario where the very system that made America a superpower becomes the weight that drags it down. But as the global order fractures, we have to look deeper. Because while the economists see numbers, the prophets saw nations. And as the smoke clears over Hormuz, a much older story is beginning to emerge. A story that was written long before the first dollar was ever printed. But let's step away from the war rooms for a moment. Let's look past the red icons on the satellite maps and the flickering data points of the stock market. Behind the fog of Operation Epic Fury, there is a reality that no missile can target. It is the breath of 80 million human beings. In the crowded streets of Tehran, in the ancient alleys of Isfahan and Shiraz, life continues in the shadow of giants. Think about the fathers there. They aren't thinking about game theory or the strategic depth of the Strait of Hormuz. They are worrying about the price of bread for their children. Think about the young people. They don't want a war with the West. They want to be part of the world. They are students, artists, and dreamers who are tired of living inside a fortress of sanctions and rhetoric. These are not ghosts on a radar screen. They are the heirs of a brilliant Persian civilization that gave the world the poetry of Rumi and the first human rights charter of Cyrus the Great. This is the hidden cost of the attrition Professor Zhang describes. It doesn't just burn through fuel and currency. It burns through the future of an entire generation. When we argue about who wins and who loses, we have to ask ourselves a difficult question. What is a victory worth if the land is left in ashes? Perhaps the real reason we watch these geopolitical shifts so closely is not just to prepare for a collapse. It's to remind ourselves of the fragile value of peace. Because true victory isn't found in controlling a shipping lane. It's found in the moment a people can stand free on their own soil, looking toward a future they actually own. Behind the smoke of the battlefield, the ultimate goal of history isn't the dominance of a superpower. It's the liberation of the human soul. But as we look at the struggle of the Persian people today, we realize something startling. The current regime is not the end of their story. In fact, the Bible tells us that this modern hostility is actually a total reversal of a much older, deeper friendship. To understand why Persia is at the center of the world's attention in 2026, we have to look back 26 centuries. We have to look at the moment the liberator became the enemy. If you only look at the news in March of 2026, you see a nation determined to burn the global order down. But if you look at the ancient scrolls, you see a mystery that defies human logic. How does a nation go from being the greatest protector of God's people to their most relentless enemy? History remembers Cyrus the Great. He was the Persian king who liberated the Jews from Babylon and funded the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The Bible actually calls this Persian king God's anointed. But Ezekiel, writing from the banks of the river Chebar 26 centuries ago, saw a different future. In Ezekiel 38:5, he lists the names of the coalition that will rise in the latter days: Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya. He saw them forming a massive military alliance that would one day march toward the mountains of Israel. For centuries, that prediction seemed impossible. Persia and Israel were ancient allies, until 1979. The Islamic Revolution didn't just change a government, it flipped a prophetic switch. Suddenly, the liberator was the aggressor. The friend was the foe. But if we only focus on the destruction in Ezekiel, we miss a profound layer of hope buried in the text. Because there is another prophecy about this specific land that most analysts covering the 2026 war never mention. It's found in Jeremiah 49 regarding Elam, the ancient geographic core of modern-day Iran. God declares, "I will break the bow of Elam, the chief of their might." Think about that word. A bow is a weapon of projection. It allows you to strike from a distance. In 2026, Iran's power lies exactly there, in its long-range missiles and its proxy networks. By breaking the bow, the prophecy isn't talking about destroying the Persian people. It's talking about dismantling the specific regime that uses them as a weapon of terror. And look at the promise at the very end of Jeremiah's vision. "But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam." This is a promise of restoration. While Professor Zhang sees a war of attrition that exhausts the West, the Bible sees a divine intervention that sets a people free. The breaking of the bow is the end of an era of oppression and the beginning of a return to the destiny Persia once held as a deliverer. But this leads us to the most disturbing question of all. If Persia is there, and the coalition is formed, and the war is raging, where is the most powerful nation in the world? If the United States is the one launching Operation Epic Fury, why is it conspicuously absent when the dust finally settles? The answer to that question is found in the data of silence. Look at the map of the latter days one more time. The map described 26 centuries ago in Ezekiel 38. You see the names clearly. You see Russia. You see Turkey. You see Libya and Sudan. And as we've discussed, you see Persia, modern-day Iran. But as you scan the text, you realize there is a void, a massive, glaring absence that should chill anyone living in the West today. Where is the United States? Where is the superpower currently prosecuting the largest military operation in Middle Eastern history? In the vision of the prophet, the nation that commands the world's oceans and controls the global sky is nowhere to be found. It is conspicuously, hauntingly absent. In data science, we often talk about something called the data of silence. It's the idea that the most critical information isn't always what is being shown on the screen. It's what is missing. Psychologists call this reverse confirmation bias. We are so used to America being the protagonist of every global story that we instinctively search for it in the ancient texts. We look for symbols, an eagle, a young lion, a distant coastland. We try to force the superpower into the script because we cannot imagine a world without it. But what if the silence is literal? What if the Bible doesn't mention the United States because, by the time this final coalition marches against Israel, America is no longer a factor? Think back to the thermodynamic collapse we analyzed earlier. Think about the broken bow of the petrodollar and the systemic exhaustion of the 2026 war. If Professor Zhang's game theory is correct, if the war of attrition drains the American system to the point of bankruptcy, then the silence of the prophetic text starts to make perfect, terrifying sense. An empire that cannot fund its fleet cannot project power. An empire buried in debt and paralyzed by internal strife eventually retreats into the shadows of isolationism. It doesn't have to be destroyed by a nuclear bomb to disappear from the prophetic map. It only has to become irrelevant. Being unnamed in the history of the future is the ultimate form of collapse. It is the death of an influence, the end of a global operating system. We are witnessing a moment where the mathematical projections of a Beijing professor and the visions of a Babylonian prophet are converging on the same dark point. The question is no longer, who will win the war of 2026? The question is, what kind of world are we entering when the giant finally sits down? And more importantly, are you ready for what comes next? We don't analyze these maps and ancient scrolls to spread fear. We do it to give you the one thing that matters most: clarity. We watch so that we can prepare. The convergence of game theory and prophecy tells us that the world is no longer what it seems. The giant is weary, and the system is breaking. But in that breakdown, there is a chance to find your own foundation. So, I want to hear from you. What is your secret weapon for the days ahead? Is it the logic of hidden technology or the peace of a spiritual anchor? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay vigilant. I'll see you in the next one.